Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about design education and practice. Today on the show, I am joined by the designer, writer, and educator, Eric Heiman. Eric is principal of Volume, the San Francisco-based design studio he co-founded in 2001, and he has also been teaching at the California College of Art since 1999 and has written for publications like Emigre, and Design Observer. I've known Eric for a long time and have been a fan of his work for years, and something that's always been interesting to me about him and about Volume is how they've sort of resisted the Silicon Valley tech world that oftentimes feels like it has completely subsumed the design world in San Francisco and the Bay Area. There's a group of small design studios out there who have really held tight to the work that they are interested in and have carved out a unique space for themselves. And Volume is one of those. So in this conversation, which we recorded back in April, I asked him about that. I asked him what it was like to be in design school in the Bay Area during the dot-com bubble and the height of Emigre, to be kind of right where all of that was happening, and then what it's like now in the middle of another tech boom. We also talk about writing and teaching and how those influence his practice, and especially the gaps that he sees between design education and design practice. I think there's a lot in here for practitioners who also teach, and kind of how to think about both sides of that, as well as for students who are thinking about their time in school and their future careers. Remember that Scratching the Surface is made possible because of listeners like you. If you enjoy the show and want to help support it, you can become a member for just $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter written by me, as well as previews of the upcoming episodes. If you like Scratching the Surface and want to see it continue, please consider becoming a supporting member. It truly means so much to me. For all the details, you can visit scratchingthesurface.fm/members. Thank you, as always, for listening, and here is my conversation with Eric Heiman. You were at CCA as a student in the 90s. Mid-90s or so. You started teaching in 99, and then started Volume in 2001. And as I was thinking about it, that like late 90s, early 2000s is an interesting era, both for graphic design, but also for San Francisco. In Emigre was happening. There was like really interesting kind of writing, right down the road, basically across the bay from you. There was the kind of first .com bubble. San Francisco was changing. Where were you in that moment? Obviously as a student, and then kind of transitioning into a professional. What was that like to be in San Francisco at that time?
Well, it was when I was a student, it felt like it was sort of the tail end of that sort of what I would call postmodern explosion. I remember in school, like my typography teacher, Leslie Becker, going, "You need to subscribe to Emigre magazine. You all should check out this magazine, Ray Gun," that had just sort of started. And it was very exciting, I think, because the profession as a whole at that time was in this self-analysis questioning mode. I think the reason magazines like Emigre and were very fertile then is because the profession as a whole, I think partially due to technology, but also just other factors too, was in this, what is legibility? What is design? Where can we slot it? Are we artists? Are we designers? And so it was a really exciting time in that respect. And as someone, I think, who relished this idea of design as this practice and device in which to not just like solve problems, but actually question things and interrogate things was really exciting. And because we had this really interesting mix of instructors from all different kind of parts of that explosion, it made for a really interesting dialogue. I think what was also special about CCA then is that it was mostly instructors who were also full-on practitioners too. And so we were getting this very interesting mix of instructors who really wanted to push the envelope, but then were also doing it for real. Some of them in very traditional commercial
Mm-hmm.
practices, like, the Michaels were all still teaching when I was there, but people
Mm-hmm.
like Lucille Tanasis and Martin
Yep.
Vanesky were starting to teach there. And so it was very fertile time. And then once I got out of school, the economy was starting to crest based on this tech thing that was really starting to, explode in San Francisco. And so um, I personally did not have a lot of interest in that at the time. I went
Okay.
to go work
Okay.
for a studio that was a more traditional studio. It was called Zimmerman Crow Design, which is now Vehicle. And, we did
Mm.
a lot of, the sort of stuff that design firms did then, which was everything from, I don't know, working for companies like Levi's, which is in San Francisco, to
Mhm,
doing
mhm.
annual reports, to I'm trying to remember some of the stuff we were doing back then. I mean, I think what was really great about California that felt very different to me coming from Pennsylvania and coming out of architecture school in Pittsburgh um, was there was this sense that design could be expressive and could really jump fences in terms of where it could slot in. A lot of these people like Michael Vanderbyle and Michael Manmery were doing like trade shows and monuments and fashion labels and things like that. And then with the combination of the technology thing coming in, it felt very, just the energy level was high. I've always sort of relished that about this place, and that you could come here and reinvent yourself, and there weren't as many sort of rules
Mm.
of how you practiced or rules of taste or whatever the rules were. It just felt a lot more free to, in terms of reinvention, which is what I was trying
Yeah.
to do by going to school at TCA and coming out to California in the first place.
Can you? So I have two questions, kind of in that, and one of them will kind of keep this thread, and the other one's kind of jumping farther into the future. Can you talk more about that reinvention? You studied architecture at Carnegie Mellon, and then did you immediately move to San Francisco after you finished architecture school?
More or less. I spent the summer working for a small architecture firm that I had been working for about a year at the
Okay.
time. But I mean, it wasn't necessarily the plan to go to California, as it was just to sort of figure out the next step. I think that
Mm. Mhm,
part of, I mean, I loved my architecture education, and it gave me so much in terms of rigor and this sort of being able to look at things systematically and holistically,
mhm,
looking at things more experientially as opposed to just visually. Um,
mhm,
and all those people in my class are still, really, a lot of them are still really my best friends in the world. So I don't have any ill will towards my architecture education. It was really fantastic. But I think as it moved along a little bit further, I began to realize that I had much more broad interests
mm,
that were always
mhm,
hard to kind of wedge into the architecture practice. And I think I was a DJ in college. I took a lot of humanities classes. I was very much into literature and the humanities sides of things, and it just felt like my architecture teachers were always like, it was architecture and nothing else. And
right.
um
Yeah.
and I think it takes a lot of moxie and work and concentration to be an architect, and so I don't begrudge them for pushing me that way. But I just felt like that wasn't my personality. There was also sort of a
Mhm.
cocksuredness about being an architect too that I don't think I had, especially then.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so I think what happened was, I remember I got a job uh, with a family friend's firm in Minneapolis, and it was really a recession at the time, and so I was lucky to get it. And I remember I got out of the interview and I was walking through the streets of Minneapolis and going like, if I take this job, this is the end of my life. Like this is so wrong. And I tell students this a lot. I'm like, look, part of it is really trusting your gut, even if you're young. It's really sort of thinking about, because that first move that you make, especially out of school, is a big one. And so I actually ended up turning the job down, staying in Pittsburgh, making some money, and then me and a friend kind of hatched this idea that we would just take 2 months to see every state in the lower 48, just drive around.
Nice.
And then one of my classmates had already moved to California, and this was before cell phones and email. And I was at mutual friends, and he said, hey, is Eric there? I want to know if he's interested in signing a lease with me in Oakland. And it was pretty by chance. I just went out there, and then you couldn't get any architecture work, and it was really hard. And I was competing with these two friends of mine who I was living with at the time for architecture jobs. And I just kind of saw it as an excuse to sort of maybe try to reinvent the narrative, reorient the narrative of where I wanted to go. And so, I ended up working in a cafe as a bike messenger. I worked at a record store for 6 months. I went and lived with my uncle in Maui for 3 months and worked with children with physical and mental. It was really sort of a walkabout of sorts. And you could do that at the time because the Bay Area was cheap. You could sort of tread water a little bit, and in the middle of all that, I kind of had this sense that I wanted to do graphic design. The story's getting too long. You can edit this part out too. Because it's hard to tell in a linear fashion. My last semester of architecture school, I also took this class called Building a Journal, which was about creating an architectural journal for the school, because all the Ivy League schools had one, and we didn't.
Right.
And somehow I got tasked on the team with trying to figure out how to design it. And so I remember I went down to the graphic design people that I knew, their studios, and I said, hey, I have to figure out how to do this. Can somebody help me put me on the right track? And so I ended up camping out in their studios for like a month and just putting this journal together, like half like digitally, half old school way. It was sort of the early 90s, so we're in the middle of that. And at the end of it, I'm like, this is what I should be doing. This is really fun. This is the first time I felt like, whoa, this feels like where I should be. So, but I was literally 2 weeks away from graduation when we did this. So, I think I feel bad for students now because I feel that there's just a lot more economic and competitive pressure, and that ability to just kind of stop and really take stock of where you want to be and what you want to do is so much more of a luxury. And I was just really lucky that I had that opportunity. And so during that year I was in San Francisco, I literally went to a show at SF MoMA. I just stopped into SF MoMA, and there was a show about 4 graphic designers in the Bay Area.
Interesting.
It was Michael Mannering, Michael Vanderbilt, Michael Cronin, and this guy, Jerry Reese. And I looked at the stuff and I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. Like, this is what I want to do. And I saw that they all taught at CCAC, it was called at the time. And so I learned that CCA was literally like down the street from where I was living at the time in Oakland. And I walked in and I said, I really want to do graphic design. I'm this 24-year-old architecture grad. I don't know if you have a place for me, because they didn't have a grad program then. And they're like, oh, well, you'd actually be one of the younger students in our graphic design program. It's a big second degree program, and you would fit right in. And I said, well, you know what? Maybe I'll try a semester, take out some loans, and see what happens.
That's
and
amazing.
That first semester was like, oh my God, like I have found myself. And literally, Jarrett, since that moment, it's just been this slow trajectory. And I think that another thing I tell students a lot is like, really say yes to things, when you're young.
Right. Yeah.
Because you never know where it might take you. And I think that I don't see myself as this super adventurous person necessarily, but at the time it just felt like, I need to be adventurous now or I'm going to be miserable for the rest of my life. And I was just really lucky that these certain points connected, these dots connected, because if they hadn't, I don't know where I would be right now.
Do you have a sense of what it was about graphic design that gave you that feeling? Even when you were working on the architecture journal, we are like, oh, this is the thing that I was supposed to do. And then when you get into that semester at CCA and you're like, you have found your people, you have found kind of the thing you're supposed to do. What was it about design that did that for you? Do you know?
Well, I think there was a few things. I think one was that graphic design. I mean, you have to remember that, like, when I was growing up in a small town in Pennsylvania, I didn't even know what graphic design was. I didn't
Yeah,
know it
yeah.
existed as a job or even a term. I mean,
Right.
obviously, I knew things were designed, or I could,
Mm-hmm.
but it never occurred to me that somebody actually did that for a profession. Um, and I think when I began to realize what it was, I was at Carnegie Mellon as someone who was really into, music and music packaging and,
Yeah.
books and things like that. I began to realize, like, oh, like, I want to do something that feeds into things that in film and things like that.
Right.
I
Right.
want to do things that are more directly linked to that. Um, I think I like the immediacy of design. Architecture is often this really long haul with a lot of, we work with a lot of architects now on these jobs, and it's these jobs are sometimes like 4 or 5 years long. And there was something really nice about being able to create something more quickly, and the immediate gratification of seeing it, in front of you, even though
Mm-hmm.
back then the processes weren't as quick as they are now. And then I also think too, for me, graphic design has always been about typography and the written word. Um,
Mm.
and I've always been, reading has always been this, and books have always been this centering thing for me since I was a very young child. And so to be part of something that is developing content very directly, or being
Right.
connected to content very directly, or visualizing that content in a way, to me is very meaningful. And I guess I'm just a much more literal minded person. Architecture was so much about abstraction. You had these ideas,
Yeah.
but they were always abstracted into like building form and program. And I just like being more connected to the content that I liked in a much more direct manner. And I think it's really that connects me to it. And going back to some of that stuff in the 90s, I was always much more interested in the people that found this balance between expression and communication, as opposed to obliterating communication, which was kind of the
Right.
thing back then. And so a lot of these big designers, whether it was like David Carson or and his ilk, I mean, I liked what they did from a strictly formal beauty place, but it always bothered me that they tended to think, or at least visually, it tended to look like, we don't care so much about the actual content or communication here. We just care about being expressive. And that
Mm-hmm.
side of me always was irritated by that. And I think it
Right.
was, and I
Right.
think it was also coupled by, I was lucky enough in school, I think about a year in, to see Tibor Kalman talk.
Oh, nice.
And he was talking about Colors Magazine at that point. And
Yeah.
it's hard to tell people or get them to understand how radical colors seemed in that
Right.
moment, right?
Right.
The way it went across, when it went about what it was doing. And I remember Tibor made this comment in the lecture. He said, design is just a language. It's what you do with it that matters. And
Mm.
that really stuck with me.
Mm-hmm.
And it was coupled by the fact that I was sending this work back to my family, who are very smart, creative people. That was this very 90s looking design, and going like, what are you doing? You know?
Right.
And I thought,
Yeah.
yeah, like, why shouldn't design sort of aspire to be a little bit more widescreen, in both in terms of the content that it tackles, but also the audiences that it goes after? And so that lecture really changed the way I looked at things. And I think moving forward, even though it still was a very expressive time and I'm still that kind of designer, I think, at heart, there was always this other side of it, like, who am I doing this for? What is it about? how is it moving the needle? That still sticks with me today. And I think it's always been that dynamic, that push and pull between a lot of the kind of postmodernism stuff that I love expressively, and then this kind of Tibor Kalman colors thing that has always been the kind of yin yang or tension in my work.
You are also someone who is talking about, content, talking about communication, talking about language, talking about reading, and you have done quite a bit of writing also. Where did the writing part come in for you, that you could also be a writer, I guess, or write about these things in addition to just producing it?
Yeah, I mean, I always joke that my design writing career has really been by accident, and going back to that saying yes thing a lot. I mean, I think my interest in actually writing, I mean, I never had the confidence that I could write anything. And then I had a really amazing professor at Carnegie Mellon who taught in the humanities department, but would teach these history classes that wove art and culture into the historical continuum. And he would make us write these crazy essays like Dorothy Day and Margaret Atwood go for a walk or come to your house and want to discuss their two books. What's the dialogue between them and you? And
wow.
And it was these very creative prompts, right? That in a way that you could never sort of like steal an essay online and kind of submit, right? I think that was part of it, even though it was pre-internet. And, the class was really engaging. And I think he made us, the last project was write a short story of your life and then have these two, actually it was have Dorothy Day and Margaret Atwood discuss it. And so I don't know, I don't know how to write a story. So I just sat down and I kind of wrote what was going on in my life and had connected it and then had them talk. And then I remember he made us come to his office to pick up the essay, and I came in and he goes, "Oh, Eric, oh my God, sit down." And I said, "Okay." And I was really scared because this guy was like this very diminutive, older, Jewish man. And, I was Jewish too. So I know the type, but he was a little intimidating. And he sat me down and he just started asking me these questions. Like, tell me a little about your life. And so I started telling him. And then he said that, this essay that you wrote is amazing. And he's like, I don't know if anybody told you that you could write or the way you think, but you should really think about, keep doing this, because I think that no matter what you end up doing, I think it'll serve you well. And it's amazing how one sort of piece of positive reinforcement can really set you on your way. And in architecture school back then, you got very little of it. So,
right.
And so, what happened was, I kept in touch with him until he died in the mid 90s. And then, it never really crossed my mind to do it. I mean, I wrote essays at CCA and they were well received. But I think it was really two things. I took a class with the writer Pilar Villadas, who wrote for the New York Times for a long time. She was in San Francisco, and she taught a class in the architecture department about writing about architecture. And she really sort of taught me a lot of the nuts and bolts and was also really encouraging. And then what happened was, when I was applying for my ranked non-tenure teaching job, because the panel all knew me and knew my work, I decided instead of presenting the work, I would actually write like an essay presentation and talk about the things that are important to me as a designer and as a teacher.
Oh, interesting.
And I finished it, and Michael Vanderbilt was on the panel, and he came up and he said, "That was really awesome. You should send that to Rudy Vanderlands." And I was like, okay. And so I sent the essay to Rudy Vanderlands, and he said, "This is great. We're going to publish it in the next issue." And then I saw it as a badge of honor that in the following issue, Kenneth Fitzgerald totally went after me in his essay. And I was like, all right, so maybe I am onto something here. And so, and then the chair of my department asked me to write something for the TDC. And then I met John Walters at a conference, and he said, "Oh, do you want to write something for I?" And then the SF MoMA started their open space blog, and they wanted a design person, and somebody recommended me there. And that was really fun because I could write about anything I wanted, through a design lens. And really it's just been this kind of this sort of accident, really. And And I'm not a writer by trade. And it's tough to be a design critic when you're a design practitioner too. I think some people thread that
Mm-hmm.
needle really well, like Michael Beirut, I think is probably the best example. But
Mm-hmm.
I tend to use the writing, I think, as when I'm getting to like a boiling point and something needs to be said. Like there's something that is bothering me so much that I feel like
Right.
I have to
Right.
say it. And so I think that's the reason that I don't write as regularly. And
Mm-hmm.
I think also part of it too is that both the practice and especially my teaching lately have sort of fulfilled a little bit more of the critical. Like I think the
Yeah.
debate that you're probably having a lot, I would think, Jarrett, is how much does design writing move the needle, or is it better to
Yeah.
be actually, if you are a practitioner, to be trying to move the needle in what you actually do? And I think this is a debate that I have a lot with myself, is like, where does writing practice fit into all this? And is it is it
Mm-hmm.
is it doing is it doing enough to push forward the ideas that are important to me, or is it better for me to be doing it, as a designer, as a teacher? And I think this is a debate I have a lot.
I'm with you completely, and I think that's why I kind of stumbled into teaching and realized that teaching was actually the thing that I enjoy the most out of all of this kind of, these kind of activities, because it fed that kind of critical side in a way that was stronger than actually just writing about it, because you were discussing it with other people, you were kind of getting immediate feedback, they were bringing other ideas, and it felt like it actually had some sort of impact instead of just, writing a text and then kind of putting it out into the world. You mentioned that you think it's hard to be a practitioner and a critic. And you had this professor when you were in architecture school. It's like, hey, you should keep writing no matter what you do. This will benefit you in some way. Do does writing, and we can kind of divorce that from criticism, does writing have a place in your practice, at volume, uh, that is kind of influencing the design in some way, or is that part of your process, or part of the studio in some way? Does that make sense? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I think that one of the things that I'm very proud of is whether it's making a pitch to a new client, whether it's talking about our work, in a conference setting, or to students that come visit our studio, or even when presenting ideas for the work. I think that what I'm very proud of is that a lot of people will say to me and say to us that, I've never heard anybody talk about the work like you do before.
Mm,
And I think that comes from, and this is why I feel like the teaching and the practice and the writing are this kind of, if one of them were to completely drop out, I think I and the practice would be lesser for it. Is that, when you're in the classroom, you can't help but want to be a little bit idealistic about the potential of what we
right,
do.
right,
And so
yeah,
I
that's
think that,
exactly right.
yeah, and I think that keeps you honest as a practitioner, as honest as you can be, under the economic and, the other factors that it takes to do design in what I would call, a fairly traditional manner at this point, the way our
Hmm.
practice is. Um, and I want to bring that idealism, and I also want to bring that, I don't know, kind of, it's less like Pollyanna-ish idealism, which we have too much of, I think, in the design world, and more just like
Hmm.
this aspirational, poetic potential of what design can do. Has always been something that I have believed in, as much of a Gen X skeptic that I can be at the same time. I think I still believe in that a lot, and so I want the work to have that power and that depth and that richness. And I think that, um, clients still want to hear the business speak too, and I'm terrible at that. I admit. It's my business partner that actually is really good at sort of bringing it down to earth and really
Yeah.
talking about how it would work, and that's why I think we're a really good pair. Is because we complement each other well. But
Mm-hmm.
I really, that comes from, me really thinking this stuff through writing. And maybe it's not something that appears more than maybe on our website or maybe in a blog post every once in a while. on our website or a newsletter. But I really believe in that part of design and how much the ability to express that through writing and verbally and how important that is. And I want people to know
Yeah,
how important it is to me.
it's so you're touching on something that I've been kind of struggling with lately and thinking about lately, because I think I can be uh, a pretty big design skeptic, and I can be kind of down on the industry and can complain a lot about how how we work and how we talk about ourselves and the kind of work that we do, and can be really pessimistic about the future of graphic design. But when I am teaching is also when I am the most optimistic. And maybe that's that idealism that you're talking about, where a lot of that skepticism and pessimism, whether I am kind of consciously suppressing that or not, I'm not totally sure. I haven't thought about it this way before. But I also present that kind of best best vision, that idealism. Um, do you not have that idealism in the practice? Is that something that's only in the classroom for you, or how do those start to talk to each other?
Um, you know, I, I think that there's this idea that that idealism and skepticism can't live in the same world. I feel like
Mm.
skepticism and cynicism are very different, or skepticism and pessimism are very different. I think
Mm, mm, mhm,
skepticism
mhm.
is healthy. I think it's this idea of how we make things better. I think it's how we
Right.
suss out,
Right.
the stuff that's bad or fake or whatever. And so I think for me, I'm like you. I go into the classroom and I get jazzed. I'm super
Yeah.
idealistic about
Yeah.
the potential. In some ways, I'm often the cheerleader that's keeping students
Right.
out of
Right.
their very cynical,
Right.
skeptical
Right.
things. But I also think that it's important to um design to me is not just art, right? There's
Right. Right.
constraints, there's audiences, there's context, there's, depending on how the scaling of it, there's ethics, there's a lot more things that go into it. And I want students to really be rigorous in their evaluation of their work. And I think that requires a degree of skepticism, of being willing to
Mm,
really be your
mhm,
own worst critic and
mhm.
allow us as your peers to critique your work and push you along. And I think this goes back to my architecture training too. I mean, when I got to design school, I was in California too. It was like everybody is too nice. Like, if you want to make the work
Yeah.
better, we have to start talking about this and a little bit more frankly. And I think that, again, I'm sort of meeting in the middle here. I think that the way I was taught and when I was teaching early on, I think it was too harsh to be
Mm,
totally honest. But I think there's a balance, and so I'm really looking for students to be, at the end of the day, I want them to be really critical thinkers first and foremost. And I think
mhm,
that
mhm.
the making and the process and all that stuff is really important, and certainly I'm on them about that too. But I want them to be able to look at something and really kind of break it down and go, this is what's working, this is what it isn't, or this is what isn't working for me and why. What's the personal sort of lens that you're bringing to this? Why are you doing things a
Mhm.
certain way? Why don't you respond to A but respond to B? I mean, to me, it's less about cynicism and pessimism and more about just a healthy skepticism of, like, we
Right.
can
I like
always
that.
make this better. The only reason we finish is because we have deadlines and we have to turn it in, right?
Right. Right.
Mm-mm.
Right. I always think of that was it was like Michelangelo probably, or like Da Vinci. I don't know if he either of them really said this, but it's this idea that a painting is never finished, only abandoned. Um, and that's kind of how I think about all my work. It's like, oh, this stuff is just abandoned right now.
Yeah. I mean, thank God for deadlines. I mean, I have so many like
Yeah.
self-starter projects I've never finished because I've never had the impetus to do so. I mean, it's funny how designers get so dependent on this sort of the scaffolding in which we can sort of hang the work and get it done.
I mean, that's kind of what I wanted to ask you about, because it kind of goes back a little bit to what you were saying earlier when you were a student and you were kind of caught between or interested in both sides of the kind of postmodern debate
Mm-hmm.
in, the Tibor idea that this can be expressive, but it also has to kind of serve this purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And something that I think about a lot as a teacher, and I see this in my students also, is the intersection or the balance between expression, point of view, what the student, or, we don't even have to limit this to students, I guess, the designer brings, the kind of personal narrative the designer brings with the thing that it needs to serve. And so when I kind of present to my students a more experimental or weird or kind of strange project, there's always like a couple students like, how's this going to help me get a job? Can I put this in my portfolio? how am
Right.
i going to how am I going to present this? And I totally get that. They're spending a lot of money to be there.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the question that I'm trying to ask is, what is the gap, or how do we close the gap, if there is one, between education and practice? And you're someone where all of your professors, you said, were practitioners also. You have now been doing that. Do you see some sort of gap there at all?
Um, I do. I mean, and I, and it's, I don't want to be, I don't want to, sort of imply that I'm the sort of ideal model of this, but I think what's happened
Right.
since I was a student is that what I would call the sort of MFA design grad has become much more prevalent. And I think
Mm.
the MFA grad is also often a teacher, um, and they often go straight into teaching. And so
Hmm.
I think I'm of two.
Yes, you're talking about me. You're
No, no,
exactly talking
no,
about
no,
me.
which is fine. But what I want to say is that I
Yeah.
think that there's something very exciting to me about graphic design, especially becoming or managing to establish itself as more of an academic sort of
Mm.
pursuit as much as a kind of applied
Hmm.
art practice. Like, I think it can only benefit us that there are more people sort of shielded by academia to do research or do experimental work to unearth
Mm.
things that might, you know, yield um, something more exciting out in the world that maybe the usual design practice might not. I think,
Hmm.
and the idea of somebody going to design school just to be a critic of design
Hmm.
is exciting to me too. I think that can only be helpful, but there's also this side of me, and it goes, and actually, it was a sort of an anxiety I had in that article I wrote for Emigre that was my thing to get my teaching job. I worry that if we sort of turn in too much on ourselves and start to just do
Yeah.
work that is just pitched at our peers and other designers,
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
it it risks being going. The worst that could happen was that it becomes like a printmaking or a fine art discipline that becomes this arcane kind of thing that only a certain amount of people do and understand, and it stays there. Um, and that's a
Right.
very extreme view of it. But what I don't know if you're experiencing this where you teach, but we have an IXD interaction department now,
Mm.
and it's being run, or it was run or started by somebody who was high up at IDEO, um, and sometimes I've sat in on their crits, and they are really sort of focused on, like, how does this thing function in context?
Yeah.
What does it do for
Yeah.
people? And I think students, not only people in the world, but students are like really engaged by this idea that my work could have an effect out in the world. And I feel if graphic design twiddles its thumbs a little bit with the same old sort of poster contest, I
Exactly.
get a little worried. And so, I tell students that graphic design is both this nexus and void right now. It's a nexus in the sense that
Mm.
so many things feed into it right now. But if we're
Hmm.
not careful, if we don't sort of own what we do a little bit more and acknowledge that there are all these things converging on us and talk to them, it's going to become a void, in the sense that architecture is going to take the little bit that they can do, and interaction design is going to take the little bit that they
Right.
can do, and industrial design. And so I still
Right.
think what we do is really important. And I still think it's important to push people to be experimental. You're in school to suspend time to allow you to find your voice and find what it is you want to do. But at the same time, I'm always very coaching in the fact that, like, I want them to think about context and who it's for, because I think fundamentally that's still a part of what we do. I also think too that, when you're in an art school like CCA, that casts a big shadow. And I think that this idea of being an artist and always making it new becomes also, I think, a pressure on the students. And so
Yeah.
what I often tell the students is like, don't worry about making it new. Worry about making it true to what you're trying to design, appropriate to what you're trying to design. Try to make it yours. Try to put a little bit of yourself in there. And then I think if you do that, it might be new, but don't get hung up so much on making it quote unquote new. Don't get hung up on trying to develop a style that is all yours. Really focus on those things, and maybe that new part will spring organically out of that instead.
That is so well said. I have a couple questions to kind of begin to wrap this up, and I'm not totally sure why I'm thinking about this. Maybe I lived in San Francisco for a while. I left 5 years ago, so I sorry to bring it back to San Francisco again.
That's okay.
But I think there's something interesting about you and about volume in being a studio that's now 20 years old in San Francisco. And I remember when I lived in San Francisco, there were like tons of Medium posts at the time. That shows you like the era, about how the tech companies were kind of stealing all the studios and graphic design was being subsumed by product design. And I would love to just kind of hear your thoughts on someone who, like we started, opened a studio kind of at the end of a .com bubble. What that's like now, how you've kind of navigated that. Do you kind of have thoughts on that? And then, maybe secondarily, and this might get too complicated, but I have a lot of students who, when you kind of ask them what kind of jobs they want, they say, product design, we want to work at Google, want to work at Apple. What's that like, kind of being in the belly of that world and kind of retaining that independence that you've been able to do?
Yeah, I mean, you've touched on something that has been on my mind for a long time as a teacher, as a practitioner. I mean, I think that San Francisco is such a strange place, and I used to think that it was an outlier in terms of in respect to design and design practice. And my biggest anxiety is actually it's the canary in the coal mine, in the sense that in the sense that the first thing is that I think your suspicions are right, is that I do feel that the amount of design studios that were so, there were so many of them. It seemed like the only places you could go to work when you got out of school when I graduated feel like an endangered species right now. And I think part of it is economics. I think the economics of being in San Francisco, trying to sort of support a staff who can go to Slack and get paid like $120,000 out of school. That's hard to compete with. The second thing is that students are coming out of school with a lot of debt. So it's like, am I going to work at a small studio where I can barely get by in San Francisco, or am I going to pay off my loans and go work for a Facebook or a Google or, whatever. And then I also think too that a lot of the things that I think I and some of my peers held dear about design are maybe not the things that these students hold dear, which is, I think, a more of a formalism, more of a, for lack of a better description, a kind of analog view of the world. I think that students do get excited about this idea of like, yeah, maybe I'm only designing a button, but it's a button that billions of people are going to see, right? Or I can go work at a place that gives me like all my meals paid for, and it's just like playground for the young. I understand the appeal, and so it has been a lot harder to make the case for what I do, and both in the classroom and as a business. That being said, I've always felt like our idiosyncratic, both I think point of view and the kind of work that we do, is a great filter to attract the right people. And so, even though I don't think we've been the most financially successful business, or always attracted maybe the sort of star students, right? Like especially now, um, we get a lot of really great people and a lot of really great clients, because I think the people who can connect the dots of what we do in
Right.
this sort of climate, really want to be a part of it. And as much of a struggle as it's been sometimes to just practically keep the business open, and let's just say that this time is not doing us any favors, um, I'm really proud, instinctively proud of what we've managed to maintain. And I think a lot of us who are in these smaller studios, whether it's like Tom Crabtree at Manual, or Brett at Moniker, or my old boss Dennis at Vehicle, or I'm trying to think of some of the other ones, or Todd Foreman, my friend at Public. We're kind of this little band of outsiders, which I'm glad that we're still around, and it'll be interesting to see when where this kind of seesaw roller coaster thing ends. I hope that it's a rejuvenation of this kind of model rather than its last gasp. But in terms of students, it's funny. I think, I don't know about you, but I am just as surprised as anybody how much the students are into like letterpress and risograph and all
Yeah.
these sort of,
Yeah.
what I call it the art book fair crowd, and how
Yeah.
much
Yeah.
that stuff is important to them. And half of me is just like, oh my God, we're like sending them it's like sending them into war without weapons or something. And then at the same time, I'm glad that this whole sort of what I would call resistance graphic design has erupted in these places like art book fairs, where
Hmm. Hmm.
there are these little like a punk rock zine was when I was a kid. It's like
Yeah.
these little
Yeah.
pockets of resistance that remind us of some of the things that are important to us, whether it's culture or working with your hands or just being a human being. And I think that some things that have been really big for me, I teach this TBD class, which
Right.
is basically a studio of students that does work for real nonprofits. And one of the things that has very much sort of made me realize is that um, I think I'm one of those people that's really about the quality of the interaction as opposed to the quantity. And what I mean by that is, we celebrate, Uber and Lyft for like creating these design and these designers for creating something that millions of people sort of use. But I'm like,
Yeah.
but it's millions of people that it's just a transaction. It's not that
Right.
important at the end of the day. Whereas,
Right.
or like lecturing at a big TED conference, you know what I mean? In front of like
Yeah.
thousands of people you'll
Yeah.
never meet,
Yeah.
right? For me, being in the classroom and having these one-on-one interactions,
Yep.
doing work for people that maybe it's a small nonprofit, but God, they need it so much, and it'll mean so much to the people that they're serving, even if it's only 500 people per se, or even less. I really think designers need to shift their mindset a little bit to the quality of the interactions that they're creating, and
I
not just
love
this
that.
idea of scale being the most important meter. And so I think that it would be nice to see conferences acknowledge something between the sort of big in-house Uber designers that show the new rebrand, and then the kind of one kind of
Mm,
iconoclast single practitioner that just does stuff for their self. It would be nice to acknowledge this sort of middle ground where I think a lot of us are operating and doing really amazing stuff, but doesn't fit that sort of mold that that
yeah.
that we think attracts people. And so I'm okay toiling in obscurity, because I really feel confident about the importance and the effect of what I'm
Yeah.
doing.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. And I have two kind of separate thoughts on that are completely related. It connects back to what we're talking about with kind of writing and teaching, and where I find the classroom so much more valuable is, instead of an essay that might be read by however many hundreds of people or whatever versus 12 students to talk about these ideas. It's actually about the quality of the interactions versus the quantity of eyeballs on the essay.
Yeah.
And so I totally get that. And something else I've been thinking about lately that I think you've articulated so well is so many of these uh, like design conferences and design events are only hitting, I guess this is becoming the theme of the podcast, of like the in-betweens or the intersections between the extremes. The big agencies or studios or tech companies who are, doing these rebrands or these massive products, or it's the solo designer who's showing their work, and there's this whole middle that's lost in some way. I think you're exactly right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the other thing that's interesting too is the weird thing about my teaching practice right now. It's really kind of been not that my teaching was going bad, but it's really been a great rejuvenation. Is that a year ago, John Sueda, who runs the MFA
Mm-hmm.
design program here, said, "Hey, do you want to teach a seminar on design criticism?" And I'd never taught a seminar before, and I've always wanted to, but it's always been a little scary. I'm not a scholar. I don't even have an MFA. I don't, I'm not a quote unquote, the
Yeah.
normal seminar teacher. And what's even more interesting about this class is you have this skew of that there are a lot of students from all over the world where English is not their first language. They have a lot of different
Right.
cultural differences, compounded by the fact that it's graphic designers, industrial designers, and interaction designers, and everybody in between. And so, as a teacher, I really have to figure out sort of what is that middle ground that I can establish, as a teacher to get these dialogues going. And so I just went in and said, okay, I was asking people like, how do you do this? Oh, I give them the Walter, Benjamin essay and the Roland Barthes essay,
Yeah.
and I'm just like, yeah, I could do that, but what's going to feel relevant to them, and what's going to really kind of move the needle in a way that is not just the same lecture that you would give maybe at a conference or in a more traditional seminar. And so, what I've been doing is just kind of seeding these readings and then assigning two people. Everybody has to read them, but two people have to lead the discussion on them, and they have to
Right. Yeah.
contribute two
Nice.
articles of their own to contribute to the discussion. So I to me, teaching is really about exchange now. It's not this master apprentice thing that I think it was in the earlier days when it was more about craft. And so, and I have to say, Jared, I mean, like we're talking here, I can keep a discussion going, I think, but it just blew my mind, like how much they just came out of their shells and were really into this. And I have never gotten the good reviews that I've gotten from this class.
Oh, wow.
I mean, I get pretty good reviews usually, but these were just sort of like, this was the most important class I had this semester. I never thought about design this way. And it's just sort of like, wow. And I think that if those 30 students that I've had over the last 2 semesters go out and take this stuff and it really informs their practice in a way that might move the needle in ways that I could never have the strength for or imagine, man, that would be great. And that to me is more important. And it'd be just nice to hear these smaller stories about rather than these, big epic sort of, success stories that, I mean, look, this is the way the world works. I'm not pretending that it's going to change, but I think this is the reason I've always kind of stayed in this realm of the 1-to-1 rather than to 1 to 500,000, because it feels more meaningful. It feels like it has a bigger effect. It feels like the quality of what we're doing is better. And, and so, I think that, design, I always go back to that sort of that, I think it's a quote from Socrates where it's about, we shouldn't always or never listen to the dictates of popular opinion. We should instead prioritize listening to the dictates of reason, right? And I think that everybody's reasoning is different, but I'm okay with doing the stuff that maybe isn't popular, for lack of a better description. I just want to do the stuff that feels right. and
Right. Yeah.
meaningful.
I love that, and that's like a great way to kind of wrap up this whole conversation. I have one more question that
Hmm.
I don't mean to put you on the
That's
spot.
okay.
Because the last question is usually, what are you reading
Right.
right now? Which I would like to hear what you're reading, but I want to give a part two of that question. And are there any articles from that class that you were just talking about that you want to share with me and with the listeners? Because that class sounds amazing, and I would love to know what else students were reading.
It's interesting. It's not so much the articles are so new or anything. I think for
Mm,
me, what's
mm,
fascinating about it is seeding articles that we've known for so long into a classroom where the cultural background is and then the experience is so different.
right. Yeah.
So like, the way that I sort of teach that class is it's about sort of, these sort of concentric lenses, which it's like form, process, function, context, ethics, speculation is how I kind of do it. And so, in the form one, I literally give them the crystal goblet and under the
Nice.
surface of style, which was a
Oh yeah.
I article that Blofeld wrote that I thought really encapsulated, how form changed in the postmodern era. And, it's fascinating to hear them sort of, because those are really graphic design articles, but it's fascinating to hear
Yeah.
how the industrial design students or IXD students um, sort of wrap their heads around that, right? And it's actually quite fascinating because, you know, thinking about the crystal goblet in the context of designing digital interfaces is actually really interesting,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so for me, it's less about the content being so new and different, and more how we frame it. And
Right.
so I'm more than happy to send some. I made them watch the Dieter Rams documentary because I
Oh
think there's a
yeah.
lot
Yeah.
in there. There's that speculative everything book that I had them read a
Oh yeah. Yeah.
section from. Um, I don't. I'm not trying to get it too. Oh, I make them. We do a whole thing on design thinking, and so I make them read the IDEO thing, and then I make them watch the
Oh yeah.
Natasha
Yeah.
Jen videos, and then I make them read
Yep.
the Koi
Yep.
Vin response that he wrote on his blog. I mean, I think for me too, it's important. Writing for me and the writing that I like to read is, to me, it's more about writers that can anecdotally talk about how design fits into everyday life and the
Right.
experience of it. I think it was Alice Twemlow that said something about, if design criticism really wants to, be noticed, it really needs to talk about how design intersects with everyday life and the everyday
Yeah.
world. And I think
Yep.
she's really right about that. And so I'm drawn to writers and readings that do more of that than get instead maybe into more about the design process of how someone made things, or really sort of dense theory. I think I give people bibliographies to say, like, if you want to read more about this idea, here's this death of the
Mm,
author
hmm.
essay that you can read, but don't feel pressure to. And actually some do, and bring it in and want to talk about it. But to
Yeah.
me, it's always about, I'm just one of those people that, I want to create work. I want to write things. I want to talk about design in the context of people that normally
Right.
don't get it. I mean, and the work that I'm most proud of in volume has been the stuff that has broken through that sort of what I'll call the design for design's sake rind,
Right.
for lack of a
Right.
better
Right.
description. And so, a lot of the reading and a lot of the writing I do is I kind of want it to speak to design as something operating out in the world, doing something,
Yep.
not just the artistic, formal quality of it in a vacuum. That's my super long answer to, like, what are you teaching in that class?
Yeah. So then
Yeah.
quickly, what are you reading right now?
What am I reading right now? Well, what I'm reading right in the immediate is, it's funny. I saw your newsletter and
Mm.
about the ways of seeing, and that is a book that I've read a
Oh
couple of
yeah.
times, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to pick that up again, because I actually remember that book being very great. And I'm, halfway through it right now. And I enjoyed the first essay so far, especially because I feel like it dials into a
Yeah.
lot of what I'm talking about here, which is not
Yeah.
to ghettoize the discussion of art in this sort of,
Yeah.
academic sort of vacuum, and instead really kind of bring it out and really talk about how, real people respond to it. What was the historical context? I think that was nice to hear from him. And then,
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those books that, like, everybody recommends that book, but how many people have actually read it in the
right.
last couple years? And
Yeah.
when I read it, I was like, this is still so relevant. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that you liked it. I'm glad you picked it up again
Yeah.
too.
No.
I've done my job.
And then, I read a lot of fiction. I just feel like it's important for designers to read
Hmm.
fiction because I think it's, again, going back to the idea of questioning and design is questioning, I think that fiction is this kind of thing that can really sort of put a mirror to you and make you
Yeah.
sort of. So right now I'm reading this book that actually is it's got a lot of hype, but actually I have to say it's pretty great and very relevant to this time. It's called My Year of Rest and Relaxation by
Oh,
Tessa
I
Mosfe.
I literally just finished reading that
Oh,
last
really?
week.
So I'm not done
Yeah,
yet.
I
So
loved it.
yeah, but
Okay.
I think it's really great, and I think it raises so many issues to me about. I mean, it's such a brilliant
Yeah.
conception of using this person that is just like off her rocker and like no filter, and
Yeah.
it really digs into these things around like taste and money and I don't know
Yeah.
everything about the way we live and the superficiality of the
It's
airs
so
that we put
interesting.
on, right, as people
Yeah.
as well as designers. And this is the time to be thinking about that stuff. And then I'm rereading Jessica Helfand's Design, the Invention of Desire book too, because
Oh,
that book just bowled me over the first time. I was just so I finished it and I was like, man, this is the book that I should have written that I couldn't have written because I can't write as good as her. Um, but
right.
I like that she was sort of starting to back up a little bit and really start to call designers to the
Yeah.
mat around things, around
Yeah.
ethics and stuff like that. And I think it's a good thing to be reading now too. And then, and then I actually started this informal book club. We're all trying to barrel through Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, and let's
Oh.
just say I'm a Russian lit guy, but this one is a doozer to say the least. But this is the time to read the big books. I've had it on my shelf for like
Yeah. Yeah.
years. It's 1,000 pages. I'm like, let's do it. And so what I do is I read 200 pages of it, and then I do something else, and then I come back to it. But
Well, we should after we stop this recording, let's talk about that a little bit because I
yeah,
have some questions
yeah.
about Russian literature.
But yeah, well, but I also think too, it would be good to add too that there are just some books that I go back to a lot, that I give to a lot of people, and I think that and that are feeling very relevant now too. I think is you interviewed Natalia Elian, I think, on your
Oh
show. I
yeah.
haven't listened to that one yet because
Hmm.
you have so many, dude. The backlog is impossible to get through.
That's why I dropped to an every other week
Yeah,
schedule because
yeah,
everyone was telling me that.
you're but I thought her chasing the perfect book was that literally is like
Yeah.
my number one sort of, because the reason I want to bring that up is because, and I think it's a good place to end, is because I think design is in this really exciting place, right? Like I'm super excited about the currency it has. I'm super excited about things like the Letterform archive and all this interest in history and trying to build this almost like Alexandria library of design. I think is important, but I also think
Hmm.
it masks this anxiety that we have as designers for a time when we still had control
Yeah.
over things in a way that we don't anymore in a lot of
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah.
And I think that book, and by tackling that sort of aspect of modernism, really tapped into something about design and designers that I think we need to confront and consider a lot more. And I
Hmm.
just felt like she did it in such an accessible and succinct and poetic way that I find myself rereading that book a lot just to remind myself, like, let go of some of the stuff that I'm holding on to, let go of the OCD, let go. and really,
that's one of those I need to reread now that you say that. It's been a while since I've read it.
And you could read it in an hour. I mean, it's so short. It's so great.
Yeah.
And so I think that book to me is very meaningful. And I mean, I could talk about this for another episode. I have so many like that, but that one is the one that I find myself pushing on people a lot more. And it's funny because a lot of people will come back to me and go like, God, I hated that book. And I think it touches a nerve with people.
Yeah.
Because it goes into things like taste and control and those things that we as designers hold dear that I really question sometimes.
Eric, I think we should do this again sometime and just do a whole podcast talking about books because we could easily go on for another hour or two.
Anytime. Maybe we can do like this sort of team up between like the Books of Some Substance podcast that I'm sometimes on and the Scratching the Surface thing. So that would be fun.
We'll do a crossover collaboration. I think that's great. Thank you so much for doing this.
Oh yeah, thank you for having me.
This was such a great conversation.
Oh yeah, it was super fun, man, and I love what you're doing, and you know, it's really impressive what you've created in really such a short time. So you know, keep it up.
Oh, thanks.
That's all I gotta say.
This episode was recorded on April 23rd, 2020. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.